I apologise because I've not gone out and started this sermon from the beginning. That's because I've had my back injected this week, and they promised, and they've fulfilled their promise of making it a bit worse for a time. I can remember as a topic that I first preached on this at a Sunday school anniversary in quite a large Baptist church in Adelaide, and people questioned me afterwards why I would talk about it at a children's Sunday school anniversary service. But it's a lesson that we need to learn early in life. It applies for all of us, from the beginning to the end of our life. At the centre of it, there is the most hated Christian doctrine, and it's the doctrine of depravity. It's that, in fact, all of us are by nature not innocent, but responsible to somehow find a way that's acceptable to God. All right. I actually spoke to this last time to the Indians, and if we go to the next slide, it's a question. Does it all really matter? Are we just going to end up as dust in the end of a box with pleasant memories, or maybe nasty memories, thought about us in the future? Or is there more to it than that? Are you interested in cricket? Well, I was talking to the Indians, and I know that they are interested in cricket. The last major match that I played was in India, and it was great fun. But it was a relevant topic at the time because Andrew Symonds, Roy, do you remember him as a cricketer? One of my favourite cricketers. He used to bash the ball around with great heartiness. His lifestyle was a bit questionable, but his cricketing ability was fantastic. And he had just been killed in a road crash just outside Townsville. He had chosen to live here after his retiring. So the question was, we're all going to die, aren't we? I can remember when we first went to Ethiopia that the life expectancy for women was 41 and for men was 39 years. Now, and they used to in some ways be staggered at that stage, because we're talking about 60 years ago. The life expectancy here in Australia was 70. But whether our life expectancy is 39 or, as is now here for women in Australia, 91, you've got around for a long time. That sort of thing doesn't really matter. What's it all worth? The next one, we've got a series of slides to try and show that, in fact, people in all countries and all places do think that it matters, and they try and get some peace and acceptance with God. This was taken when I was in Ghana, and if you see on the side, these people are called animists. They worship nature, they worship God, but you see hanging down on their sides are all the animal pelts, the skins of the animals which they have killed in sacrifice, to see if they can't get God on their side. And if you go next one, we've got a huge religion The Islamic world. Indonesia, right close to us, the largest Islamic country in the world with 237 fairly committed people. And a lot is dependent on praying and getting right with God. Well, the next one, we've got the Asian, Hindu, whoever they people I mean, the Buddhist faith, and they have got these elaborate temples and places for worship and making sacrifices all upon the time. And the next one is a look at the Sistine Chapel. And it causes us to stop and think a bit of our own religion. Catholicism is Christianity in the overall cover of the word, as is Uniting Church included in that. What's the purpose? What's the point of our word? And the next slide, Roy Andrew Simons died, but you remember this guy was killed with a cricket ball, Philip Hughes. And I watched the memorial match that they had for him. And during the batting innings, one of the Australians made a century. And what reminded me was that he obviously lifted his bat and shouted to the crowds and personal acceptance of his applause. But then he looked up and you can hear, you can read his lips, and I've done it all for you, Philip. You're there. You're somewhere there. So remind ourselves of the death rate in all countries with the next slide, and it's roughly, approximately, next slide, yep, that's the one. It's about 100%. So it's your future. I've just been in to see my tax man this week. We can't avoid taxes and we can't avoid death. So something for us to think about. As Christians, and I'm reminded of this because I just recently heard somebody say on television, and it'll be up on the next slide, but not just here. When he was asked, and it was with that on the show with that guy who paints with a trowel. You know, he brings famous people in. And he got this guy in, and in the talking, the fellow's daughter has died some time ago. And the question was put to him, do you think you'll ever see your daughter again? And he answered, and this was significant for me. He said, we have got no idea because nobody has returned. Nobody has returned. Now, that's a key phrase as we come to the end of the passage that I'm going to talk about today, about people rising from the dead. But he obviously totally discounted Jesus Christ. He must surely have known the story. And so let us go on and listen to a story which Jesus told. Now, there are an enormous number of doctrines involved in this story. And we can, at the end of it, and say to ourselves, in actual fact, did the rich man end up in hell because he was rich? Did the poor man end up in heaven because he was poor? He had nothing down here? And we're not talking about that question. As we come through, the question is this: what would happen if somebody rose from the dead? Has somebody risen from the dead? Well, I love the story. Jesus was a pretty good storyteller, after all. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and feasted sumptuously every day. I think my wife was probably his cook. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. Now, is that in our experience? Well, it may be. It may be if you've grown up in another country or lived there a while. It was certainly true for us in Ethiopia, where I saw endless patients with maggots in them. Their sores were just oozing out of pus all over their bodies, and nobody seemed to care about them. At any rate, the poor man died and was carried by the angel to Abraham's side. The rich man also died, 100% of us, and was buried. Now, if the story stopped there, we would have a lot to think about. Why did the rich man end up in a sort of heated place without air conditioners? And why did the poor man ended up in heaven? What made the difference? And that's why we talked about those various religions seeking to get on with God. Anyway, Jesus goes on. And in Hades, being in torment, the rich man lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off. Now, just to divert a bit, the name Abraham is a very significant name because it's the first name in the Bible where we have God specifically saying to him that your descendant will be the answer to the world's problems. And it, I guess, means that if Abraham was able to be there, he was alive. He called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good. Is that me? Must have been me. That you in your lifetime received good things, and Lazarus in this manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to here. And if you look at that last sentence, there are a lot of people who long for and teach that there'll be a second chance, that something will be able to be done for them. And now, we we've got to think about ourselves and our rightness with God, but we've also got to think about our loved ones. We've got to think about our friends. If that is where they end up, there is no help. And if you think that you're going to build up your muscles or you're going to improve your jumping skills, Robin won the broad jumping when she was at high school. But if you think you can build up your broad jumping skills and hop across the top of the chasm, Jesus says, I'm sorry, it's too wide. Neither way is there passage. All right, let's go on to the next one. Sorry, he said, I don't like it here. Neither would you nor I. And he said, then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house. In other words, I'm not asking for Lazarus to jump the chasm, but I want him to be your servant. I want you, and at last he's thinking beyond himself. He's thinking about his brothers. He's thinking about his family who are still living. Send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. Maybe for this area, he would have said they've got Andrew Hicks preaching every week. But the rich man, anyway, said, no, Father Abraham. Listening to Moses and the prophets or preachers doesn't seem to make a difference. But if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He, Abraham, said to him, "Ways, if they don't hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead." So an enormous amount hangs on this, doesn't it? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Why don't people listen to Moses and the prophets? Why is it that so many people, while trying to get right with God, don't listen to those who have the answers? Neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Now, you're saying we're not in that group. We're convinced. And if the next slide comes up, it reminds us of this man with his crack about not being certain. Because if in fact people were able to grasp, in fact, the truth of today, surely our living, our standards, our witnessing would be very different. And of course, we've got to end up saying, is there any evidence that Jesus came back from the dead? Well, of course, you don't believe old writings. You've got to get modern people with university degrees to look back at the old writings and say, well, they didn't know what they were talking about. They saw hallucinations. But then you think about it and you think about how the Egyptians built pyramids. They were no fools. When you read the book of Job, the philosophy, the truth in that book is much greater than I read in some modern medical journals. It's more truthful. But, they say, the writers back there, Paul says, hey, there are 500 at one time who met with him, besides others. And I've seen him myself, he says. But our modern attitude is to say that's all hogwash because it's written in the past, because it isn't written up in a daily gazette and posted somewhere and kept. It's not true. Whereas you and I know that what we read in the paper is fractionally true. Whereas at least we claim to say that what we read in the scripture is totally true. So is there any evidence that he rose from the dead? Well, there is, and I think the greatest evidence for some of us, maybe all of us, is that we've met him in our lives, that he has done something tremendous. The Bible doesn't just teach that he rose from the dead, but he's alive now. Now, we as a people, as Australians, don't spend a lot of time thinking about another world. Well, the science fiction writers seem to spend a lot of time thinking about it, but on the whole, we don't. But the instant we say that we believe in God, we say, I believe there is another world. There is another region of living. There is something which maybe I need to learn about. Well, how is he now? How is Jesus now? Thank you, perfectly well and healthy, alive and planning to return. How is Dewey's, the rich man? Alive and still in agony, because hell is endless. The last slide, I think, is Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And the apostles, his disciples, referring to Jesus, taught that there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. So mentally flick back to the earlier slides. Whether you're an animist and seeking it that way, whether you're a Muslim seeking it that way, whether you are of an Asian religion seeking it that way, or if you're a Christian seeking it in a sense our way, remember this: there is no way apart from simple trusting in Jesus. But there is a lot that hangs on finding the narrow way. You'll be glad to know that it'll be Andrew again next week, except it will take him longer.